This is our regular 8 p.m. slot on a Sunday on Socialist Telly. For those of you who haven't watched before, this is a show where we kind of kick back and we pretend that we're in some sort of normality and we're sitting in a pub having a pint or a soft drink or whatever you want, and occasionally chat about politics. So the idea behind Pint and Politics is really that it's quite casual, just like in the pub, and we're never quite sure where we'll end up, and that's fine. But thanks to everybody as well that's been watching. There's been some really good viewing figures, especially those who've commented on Twitter and Facebook. And I know a few people have even said what they're drinking, which is canny. Thanks very much for that bit of interaction. And please make sure that you're following Socialist Telly on Facebook and Twitter. We're starting to build a alternative here, and obviously we need your support. So tonight, I'm really privileged actually, and a little bit excited to be joined by 4 immense activists from the Orgreave Truth and Justice campaign. Firstly, we have Chris Peace, who's a socialist and GMB activist, and has stood as a Labour candidate in Derbyshire North East at the last election. Hiya, Chris.
Hiya, you all right?
Yeah, fine. Got to ask what you're drinking.
Yeah, well, I've gone for alcohol. You people probably won't be surprised to hear that. So I've got a bottle of Shelby, which is the official Peaky Blinders, brewed by Thornbridge.
Right.
So brewed just down the road, and it's a very nice, gentle IPA for a Sunday night.
That's classy. Well, yeah, that's great. Thank you. Then we have Sophie Wilson, who also stood as a candidate in 2019. She stood in Rother Valley. She's also an Acorn activist and Sheffield City Councillor. Hiya, Sophie. All right?
I am good, thank you.
Good. And what are you drinking?
Nothing that's going to impress anyone, but a very cheap bottle of, half a bottle of Echo Falls.
Excellent. Next we have Joe Rowling, who's a Unite Union member, activist, organizer, anti-fascist, and also I have to say the owner of the largest collection of Adidas trainers in the Northern Hemisphere. Is it fair to say? How's the collection going, Joe?
It's going quite good. I've added a few extra ones today, actually online. So
you are actually calling it.
I would have given you a guided tour of the bedroom, but I'm not sure that'll go down well, so I better not.
You're actually admitting it to being an addiction now, aren't you?
Yeah, an addiction. I've described it as. But along with the beer, it's not too harmful, I don't think.
Yeah, and what are you drinking?
I've gone for a Heineken because it's got a nice red star on it.
And finally, we've got John Dunn, who's a former Derbyshire NUM striking miner, and also, I think it's fair to say, best friend to Owen Smith.
Oh, I love him, yeah. Can't get enough of him.
If you don't understand that reference, by the way, you need to Google John and Owen, and you'll see that they've got a long-standing friendship and relationship. What are you drinking tonight, John?
Well, I don't drink anything too liquid like a pint because I'm at that age, it runs out quicker than it runs in. So, and because I'm surrounded with these middle-class people, I'm on a cheeky little Armagnac that I've treated myself to.
Oh, very nice. So we haven't had an Armagnac yet, so that's...
Well, nothing's too good for the workers.
That's right, exactly. So, thank you very much. And actually, I'm gonna start with you, John. I mean, obviously, you're all here because you're involved in the Orgreave Truth and Justice campaign. But I'm aware that there are people listening and listening in Socialist Telly tonight that won't have been around when it happened and might not know an awful lot about Orgreave itself. So I just wondered if you could give us a kind of sense of that day and what the feeling was at the time and in mining communities and the news started spreading of Orgreave.
I like to do this with a little bit of a thought experiment. I mean, I've just asked people to imagine it's 1984, it's a scorching hot summer's day. You've been on strike for a few months, you've obviously no money to go anywhere, and you're stuck for something to do. So on June the 18th, what do? You actually wake up and you think, I'm going to put on a clean t-shirt, my best pair of shorts, and a pair of...
Oh, just lost John for a second. Actually, I might come back to John because
to imagine, but with those... Sorry?
It's all right. We just lost you there, John, for a bit.
I've been lost many a time, to be honest. I say it's this unstable internet it must have called it off me. But as I say, just imagine that you've deliberately gone out, dressed for summer weather, to attack some heavily armed riot police. And what happens? You get to a field in South Yorkshire, and by coincidence, there are 6,000 coppers all there to stroll around and enjoy that sunshine like you want to. Not only that, they've took the dogs for a walk, and they've taken the horses for a pleasant ride out in that summer's day. And that's how they'd like to portray it. By some mysterious reason, for the first time in that strike, strikers were able to get to a picket. Our villages had been locked down, motorways were sealed off. It was a proper iron curtain. You couldn't get anywhere. But that day, the police actually were directing people into Orgreave. They've allocated places to park. It was if they couldn't be helpful enough. And when people got there, as I say, there's 6,000 coppers arrested. Totally peaceful picket. And as people are sort of just mingling, not doing anything, the picket itself has finished. The ranks of the police open up and out charge the mounted cavalry with the long batons, smashing anybody in their way, followed by a short shield battalion who just went wild. You know, they talk about the riot of Orgreave as if we started it, but it was actually an orchestrated police riot. And it's only by good fortune that none of our comrades were killed that day. It was totally planned from start to finish. And the police were given orders to be as brutal, as violent as they could be. And as I say, any other day, you could hardly have got out your village. Every car was stopped. And if you looked like a picket, you were turned back under threat of imprisonment. And that day is actually, it's just the tip, the most visible tip of a massive iceberg of what was happening sort of every day in every community throughout that strike. But that evening, the BBC, by some strange twist of fate, managed to reverse the footage. The 6 o'clock news showed our people attacking coppers. 10 years later, a mealy-mouthed explanation, they said that in the rush to get that news out, they accidentally reversed it. Now, I know nothing about filmmaking and putting tapes like that together, but I'm sure it's pretty well impossible to do that. It was a deliberate ploy as part of the state propaganda service, and that myth still sticks today, that we were the violent ones. You still hear people talking about, in the media especially, about when miners rioted at Orgreave, the police lay in wait. It was actually to attack and demoralize us more than anything. It was intended to prove that they had the force, they had the power, and they could do anything they wished. 95 of us were charged with offences that included riot, just for wanting a job, just for assembling peacefully on a picket line, and they faced possible life imprisonment just for wanting a job. We've now got a government that tells us it's important to get a job. That's what should motivate you. That's all we wanted. And for that, we were criminalised, battered, beaten, and framed.
Cheers. Thanks, John, for that. I've actually got a video to share which gives in a kind of overview, and it's produced by the Orgreave Truth and Justice campaign. And I'm just going to, if technology will allow me, and then we'll come back. If the technology will allow me to share this, I'll try it, and then we'll come back to some of this discussion. Just a second.
On June 18th, 1984, at the height of the miners' strike, as a flying picket, I was asked to go to the Orgreave coking plant in Sheffield. There, we were met by police officers who, supported by the government, wanted to engineer a symbolic defeat on the miners and breakers' resolve and underminers' morale. What happened that day has been dubbed the Battle of Orgreave. We were shepherded into a field, surrounded by dogs and mounted police in riot gear, armed with shields and batons, in a move that some have described as similar to kettling. At 8:20 a.m, the police charged. A senior police officer was heard shouting, "Bodies, not heads." The police aggression went on for several hours, during which numerous pickets were assaulted. Many of us were then arrested and denied medical treatment.
You had to go up this hill, and I got this tremendous pain in my chest. I thought, I can't run no more of this pain, and I just collapsed on the floor. I could see these dogs. I thought, I'm going to play dead here, dogs ripping people apart and braying them. Young men, what defence had they got against a military police? Because it wasn't military precision how they operated.
During the trials that followed, the police colluded in their evidence, intended to cover up what had really happened, and to have the pickets convicted on trumped-up charges. A recent investigation by the police watchdog, the IPCC, found new evidence to suggest that senior officers were involved in the cover-up.
I'm standing outside the coroner's court where the inquests into the deaths of the 96 people who died at the Hillsborough disaster is being carried out on a daily basis. There'd been an original inquiry, there'd been an inquest, there'd been a judicial scrutiny, and there'd been a private prosecution. So you'd have thought everything had been done, but no. What really hadn't been done was a trawl of all the documentation, in other words, a disclosure exercise. Now, the model that led to this, I suggest, could happen in Orgreave, because although there were lots of trials, didn't lead to convictions, I think the fact that it's a historical situation should not preclude the possibility of this exercise. When you look at Orgreave, it's too important to be brushed aside in that way, because it's undermined the faith not only in the police, but in the political system itself, to allow the prosecution of so many people, quite wrongly, leading to acquittal and compensation of a kind at the end of it all. But there's been no accountability. No authority has ever been brought to book over this.
The Orgreave trials collapsed, but the events had a lasting impact on the victims and in the affected communities. The truth about what happened at Orgreave has never been uncovered. The role of the government, the media and senior police officers has yet to be properly explored. The victims have never received justice for what happened. The Orgreave campaign is now seeking an inquiry to provide truth and justice for those affected.
I think it's the anger at the injustices that were dealt to decent, hard-working people who were called by the Prime Minister of the day the enemy within.
Looking back over the last 50 years, it's one of the worst cases of collusion and corruption, of evidence and of policy. And therefore, until this canker, this boil is lanced, none of us should rest happily.
Miners united will never be defeated. The miners united will never be defeated.
That's a really good introduction, I think, and well done to the campaign for producing that. Chris, what is it that makes Orgreave stand out? Why is it so important, and why should people care about it today, 36 years on? I mean, I imagine some will say.
Lost you a little bit there, Ben. lost that a little bit, but I think I gather. Yeah, why is it still important? And you are quite right. Some people would like us to just stop going on about it. But I mean, as John touched on, and I think as Mike Mansfield said at the end of that, the scale of what happened on that day and the fact that there has never been any accountability. We are left with a narrative out there, but it's not the true narrative of what happened on that day. The sheer scale of the policing, and I mean, I really want to make the point that, we saw bad and heavy-handed and violent policing throughout the strike, every part of the country, in our mining communities, villages that were basically occupied. But Orgreave as a day was very pivotal in terms of the timing of it, the organisation. But most importantly, it was really unprecedented in terms of policing of what happened before then. The militarised nature that you saw there, the sheer numbers, the police were trained in advance of this. It was, and I'm sure somebody else will touch on this, but it was all very much pre-planned. It wasn't a random event that wasn't planned for. And not only did you have the police there in numbers, but they deployed weapons to violently attack people. And we're not talking a few bruises and scrapes, we're talking broken bones and fractured skulls that people sustained. I've mentioned that there was a false narrative, and this all came out during the trial, 1985, where we had 15 miners, the first batch, if you like, of the 95 miners charged, stood trial in Sheffield Crown Court. And after 48 days of evidence where police officer after police officer was cross-examined on the content of their written statements, it was quite clear that there had been collusion in the writing of those statements, and police had put evidence, they'd put an account in a statement which they clearly hadn't seen, and it's subsequently come to our attention that those statements were actually dictated, a lot of them. So we had that. We also had a media that kind of, went along and actually promoted and backed up that false narrative. We still see that happening today. And we've got to look at, what the ongoing consequences, not just in terms of people's physical and emotional health as a result of that day. And some miners and their families still suffer trauma as a result today, which should not be forgotten, but also in our communities and within the political landscape. We've also got lots of new information coming forward, which backs up the truth of what happened there. So we had the release of cabinet papers in 2014, 2015, release of Thatcher papers. We as a campaign have helped to get over 30 Home Office files released. We've found papers, and if you don't get it already, then just think about this. We've located a number of papers, police papers, ACPO police papers from the Association of Chief Police Officers. And they are in Hull University Library, but they're embargoed until 2066. There has been a decision made that those papers will not be put in the public domain until 2066. Why withhold that? If there is nothing to be learned, nothing to be accountable for what happened at Orgreave, why have embargoed papers for the time? I can't think of an example for national security that is comparable with such a delay. So we know there's lots of lessons to be learned. The police have not got the policing of peaceful protest sorted. We've seen many examples since, sadly, that where policing has been heavy-handed. We've seen the same use of overcharging of people. So people get arrested on a minor charge, they come to court on a more serious charge. That's still something that happens. We've got a police force in South Yorkshire Police, who were the same police force where we had in the Hillsborough second inquest, same police force involved just 5 years later. All of these things mean that there needs to be proper accountability. You know, we live in a democratic society. We live in a society where the rule of law is crucial. And I'd just like to finish this little bit, Ben, by just saying, if we think we've not learnt from Orgreave, then, you know, we are in a position now where we have got a Tory government bringing in legislation under the Covert Human Intelligence Sources Bill, which is seeking to give immunity to, you know, covert operatives so that they can commit any criminal offence. We're hoping some amendments will be made. Now it's had a journey through the Lords. But we know for a fact that the NUM were infiltrated, that the NUM was spied on. We know that there were undercover police officers on picket lines. Why do we know? Because the NUM and many other trade unions are core participants to the ongoing undercover police inquiries that's still going ahead. You know, this is the landscape of state control of a policing that unfortunately has only got worse, and it's got worse because nobody has ever been held to account for what happened 36 years ago.
I think you're on mute, Ben.
Can't hear you, Ben.
The contemporary resonance of all that is just so important, isn't it? You know that that we still live in a situation where peaceful protesters are being spied on. There's all the spy cop stuff and things like that. I think that's really important. I remember, years and years ago reading the Seamus Milne book, An Enemy Within, and a lot of that is about. It's very interesting. A lot of it is about, the covert surveillance and the MI5's influence within miners' strikes. It's well worth reading that. Sophie, you're one of the people that I mentioned before that weren't alive when this was going on and when Orgreave happened. So why did you get involved in the campaign, and what is it about Orgreave that's so important to you for you to get involved as a socialist and a young trade unionist in 2021?
Yeah, thanks, Ben. A few reasons, really. I mean, firstly, I've always grown up knowing about Orgreave. I still live very, very close to the site where Orgreave happened, and I always have done. So I've always known about it. And in my community, I was actually shocked when I grew up and realised that people actually believed what the media said. I mean, the only narrative I ever knew when I was young is obviously that the police were completely in the wrong. It was a conspiracy, basically. And absolutely, there should, when it was talked about, there should be an inquest. And it was the same time I started getting political, realising that people didn't hold the same views as me. So I was starting to think about why that is. So yeah, I was kind of learning about it at the same time I was getting political, and getting more into organised politics when I was in college and then university. And then just learning more and more about it. And then there's obviously the level of, an injustice to one is an injustice to all. And, this was a massive working class injustice that happened in my community, and of course those miners deserve justice. So absolutely I'm passionate about that, but as Chris said, this has got ramifications for today. I'm a young socialist, a trade unionist, and I think the only way that we can move forward and be confident that we can achieve our goals is to have an inquiry. Because this can happen again. Obviously, like Chris said, it was unprecedented. Nothing on that scale has happened since, quite in the same way, at least in my area. But it had such long-lasting effects, which I'll talk about a little bit about later, in the community, that it is impossible to ignore. It is impossible to say that this wasn't one of the causes of what has happened to my community. And then going forward in how we fight and how we campaign, just the massive worry that this could happen again. Chris has talked about the Chiz Bill, you've talked about spy cops, and these are all really, really relevant to how we organise today, and will continue organising until we've achieved a semblance of our goals at least. So the people involved really do need to be held to account, brought to justice, so that we can have faith back in our justice system, in our police force, which are still there, as other people have mentioned, on the picket lines, protest. I'm involved in ACORN, as you said. I'm the chair of the Sheffield branch, and that involves, we rely heavily on direct action. That is our main focus, and our slogan is taking back what's ours. So, not beating around the bush, just going out and demanding, we want this. So a lot of the things that we focus on recently has been renters' rights, especially during the pandemic, and we say, say for example, stolen our deposit, you're not doing repairs to our housing, so we're going to demand that you do it. We need to make sure, we know we're not breaking the law, but we need to make sure that that the establishment, the people who make these rules, are not going to be able to use these tactics against us again. We need to sleep safe in the knowledge that we're not going to be criminalised for fighting. So as the slogan says, for what is already ours, we shouldn't have to fight for it, but we do. But yeah, I hope that sums up why it's all very, very important today, and to young activists. And as Chris said, Chris, did you say 2066? I wasn't even born, and I'll be a pensioner by the time that's out. So of course this is relevant to us all today, and will continue to be until either that day, or hopefully a long time before that, when we've had justice for this. I don't know what you're going to call it, atrocity, massive injustice, that we need to solve, so that we can carry on fighting in the future.
Yeah, and also, it just struck me then when you were saying that it would be really good, wouldn't it, if we could get Orgreave and the miners' strike onto the school curriculum as well. I think there are probably teachers out there that sneak it in there, but part of this is about education, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely, especially where I live. I learned about it from family members who weren't miners, by the way. There's nobody in my family who's ever been a miner. They all worked in the Sheffield Steelworks or the Tinsley Wire factories. That's where my family come from. But because it was such a community issue, they were all, on the periphery and involved at the time. So yeah, absolutely, especially in my area. And I'd never learned about it at school, and the schools that I went to were probably the closest you can get to the actual site, and obviously a lot of my friends, their dads and their grandparents will have been miners, and still not a mention of it in school, and not a mention of the effects that it's still having, such tangible effects that it's having on the surrounding area as well.
Yeah. Joe, I just want to talk about police tactics. John's mentioned it already earlier, but just sort of specifically about police tactics during the strike, and particularly at Orgreave. Obviously there's other examples of extreme violence, police violence during the strike, but what was it about Orgreave that made it kind of stand out?
I think we get this asked a lot in the campaign. Why did we choose Orgreave when there is so many other incidents of violence throughout the strike? And so I've made some notes, so I hope you don't mind me looking down at my notes, because I think this is really important for people to understand. When we set the campaign up 8 or 9 years ago now, what is it, 9 years now? 9 years ago now.
2012.
Yeah, so 8-9 years ago. About half a dozen of us were in a room in Sheffield, and we've all been in them meetings before, haven't we, where we're trying to set up a new campaign. And the idea that we could, with that small amount of volunteers, investigate the police violence throughout the strike were just a non-starter, really. So we chose Orgreave really clearly and focused upon that day because of the amount of images and the premeditated, orchestrated nature of what took place on that day. And we thought if we can shine a light on that incident in the strike, it'll actually open up the doors for people to look at all the other incidents. As Chris and Sophie and John have rightly mentioned, there was violence throughout that year-long strike. And in some cases, whole communities, villages and towns were actually under siege by the police. And if you go onto our website afterwards, we've got a film called Miners' Strike Stories, where you can see some of that taking place. And sometimes the miners and the communities rose up and fought back against the police. And why shouldn't they have done, you know? Let's be honest about that. But the whole point is that the amount of violence that was meted out to the miners, that was pre-orchestrated, especially at Orgreave, is something that we need to quite rightly shine a light on, like all the previous activists have said. At this point, I like to read out some facts about the strike for people to get it in their heads, because I think there's a lot of people don't realise the enormity of what happened in 1984, 1985. And Arthur Scargill said in 1984 that if the miners don't win this strike, then the whole movement will suffer the consequences. And God, how right was he? If we look at what state we're in now. So some of the facts and figures: 11,313 miners arrested, 7,000 miners injured. This is throughout the strike, and that's not just tiny little knocks on the the back of the hand or on the head or whatever. This is people who have been hospitalised. 5,653 people were put on trial for taking part in the miners' strike. 960 miners were sacked. A lot of them never went on to work again. They were blacklisted. So imagine the damage that did to them and their families. 200 miners imprisoned, and 2 miners were actually killed for picketing. Not at Orgreave, but at other incidents, and that were David Jones and Joe Green, who were both killed, and there's never been proper investigations into them deaths either. So, again, putting the strike into context, you've got to remember that the National Union of Mine Workers brought down the Tory government in the 1970s, and a big part of that, one of the big incidents in the 1970s were the miners shutting down Saltlygate, a comparable event, if you like, in the mass movement trying to close down the coking plant at Orgreave. And I think Thatcher and the rest of her cronies knew full well that they weren't going to let that happen again. They weren't prepared to let that happen again. And I think that background gives you a lot of insight into why they put so many resources in and were willing to unleash that level of violence that day on 18th of June. I think they learned the lessons, and I think us as a movement need to learn the lessons of history as well, which we don't always do. I don't think. And if you speak to the miners who were there that day, and John touched on this quite rightly, a lot of miners, flying pickets as they were known, were stopped from leaving the towns and villages to travel to picket anyway. But on 18th of June, they were actually welcomed with open arms by the police. Some of the miners that I know talk about it being like it had been at a football match, with police actually showing them where to park the buses and park the cars and stuff. And at that point, really, maybe with hindsight, people should have had a thinking, no, this is not quite right. And then what the police did, they herded everybody into one area, which they could quite easily conceal. For people involved in modern day activism who have been kettled, I guess it was like an early version of kettling, I suppose, really. And if anybody's ever been stuck in a kettle, then it's not very pleasant. But then what the police did to take it a step further is that they unleashed an unprovoked and vicious attack on miners. And John and a lot of his comrades and, you know, a lot of the miners that I know will tell you that it's a miracle nobody were killed. It's quite amazing that nobody were killed that day. In fact, one of the lawyers that we worked very closely with was allowed into the police station that night, late at night, after the miners had been refused medical treatment. And she describes a scene of wading through blood and vomit in the police cells, where no miners were allowed to be treated by the ambulance staff or anything. In fact, some miners were wrapping each other up in T-shirts and stuff because of the broken bones. So I think if you take all that into consideration, I think that explains why we concentrated on Orgreave and what the police tactics were that day. They wanted to send a clear message to the National Union of Mine Workers, and more importantly, the rank and file pickets, that they weren't going to accept the behaviour that they'd done before. They weren't going to take mass movements of working class people coming together. And throughout the strike and on Orgreave itself, again, one of the other police tactics were, one that arrested you, they'd charge you on the highest thing they could think of, they'd trump the charges right up, and then they'd stick you on bail for a year, which would mean that you weren't allowed to go out picketing again. And again, if you look at modern day police tactics, anybody involved in anti-fascist movement and other direct action movements who have suffered them bail conditions will tell you that that's what the police have learned over the years. You take out the militants, you put them on bail, and you stop them from taking part in action again. And I know myself and a lot of my fellow activists have suffered that since. So I think the police have learnt from the miners' strike, they learnt from the 70s, and we're suffering with that consequence today. So yeah, a bit of a long answer, but I think that explains why we're so focused on 18th of June.
Yeah, it does. Thanks very much, Joe. Just another kind of thing. I know this is a big question, and I don't know whether other people might want to come in and talk about this as well. You know, is that there was kind of an extensive cover-up as well, wasn't there? So you know, you've described the police violence, but then there was a continuing kind of, I mean, in a similar way to what happened with Hillsborough, continuing kind of cover-up as well.
Yeah, I'll just say one quick thing on that, because I think some of the other speakers will want to chip in on it. But one of the things that we do in Orgreave campaign, to some successes, that we encourage miners to send off a freedom of information request to ask to see their arrest document. And what we're getting back is, if it wasn't so sad and worrying, it'd be hilarious. Because when the police documents come back, invariably, we just get one name. So John Dunn, for example, I'm sure you won't mind me saying, and then just 3 or 4 pages of black print where they've redacted everything. So there's a copper sat somewhere in a police station or whatever, having to print off all these redacted statements. And if they didn't have anything to hide, then why on earth would they be redacting statements 36 years later?
Yeah, and what's quite interesting, Ben, is what they are redacting is also information that's already in the public domain. They're actually redacting stuff, going, oh, we best not let this get out. But actually, it's already out there, because, you know, the trial, you can have a look at the trial notes and read them through. So there's you know, what you say about the cover-up, if you like. It is something that was obviously already part of the plan, because once you have beaten up the miners, you've then got to fit them up, and then, you know, you've got a trial to present evidence, and that trial collapsed. The trial collapsed, and no miner was charged. And the you know, the injustice of it all is the effort, you know, public money, taxpayers' money, the effort that went into creating false evidence, which was torn apart in court, and then nobody to ask, well, not quite nobody, I might cover that later, but, you know, the fact that that happened, you know, without a whimper. If you think, I mean, I'm old enough to remember the news. You know, the amount of news coverage we had every time one miner returned to work, the amount of news coverage, the acquittal of the miners charged with so-called rioting at Orgreave, hardly a whimper from the media.
I think John will probably want to come in on this as well, but unfortunately, I don't think all the miners got the legal representation that maybe they deserved. I think maybe the National Union of Mine Workers were probably overrun with the amount of people that were being charged. So not everybody got to defend themselves as well as possibly they could have done. So some miners were given the old tap on the shoulder and look, just cough up, say you've done it. It's only maybe a smaller charge, a lesser charge maybe, but that charge then sticks with them miners for the rest of their lives and stops them from getting jobs in a lot of cases. And as we said earlier, it also stopped a lot of them miners, or scared a lot of them miners as well, from taking part in the legal right to picket, which is terrible if you think about it.
Yeah, that's a good point, Joe, about the legal representation. You have to remember that the NUM had its funds sequestrated. People were collecting in buckets and asking for donations, some of which helped fund, those trials. And it was conveyor belt justice. You didn't appear in front of a court. They bought retired judges out, called them stipendiary magistrates. I was found guilty in a courtroom that had been closed for about 15 years. They reopened it just for that. And in front of a stipendiary magistrate. And when I turned up to court, they gave me a second charge 2 minutes before I went into court. That's what they called justice in those days. And as I say, the union was fighting with both hands tied down behind its back. No funds. We were solely dependent on what we'd reckled our buckets for.
Yeah, I didn't mean that as a criticism at NUM.
No, I know you didn't, Joe.
By any means, you know.
I mean, the thing is, the state and the government put every obstacle in our way. Yeah.
Exactly, and I think it's an important lesson today for trade unionists, activists, whatever you want to describe yourselves as, that you mustn't be convinced to plead guilty. You must fight every charge, because the more of us that go through that system and have got criminal convictions for things that we haven't done, the more likely they are to do it again. And I think that comes back to the crux of why the Orgreave campaign is so important, that if you let them off the hook, they're destined to do it again, and again. And so, isn't it funny that the state always tell working class people to get over it and forget it? Imagine if it had been a police riot at Eton, or you can't imagine Boris and them saying, "No, don't worry about it, old chap. We'll just put it down to a bad day out." It's always working class people that are told that they've got to shut up and move on. I don't think we should put up with it, and I think that's why the campaign's so important to me, and I know it's as important to me as it is to hundreds of others.
Yeah, good point, Joe. John, just to think about the politics, the wider sort of context of Orgreave, and you did mention this already being kind of tip of an iceberg, but just in terms of the kind of decisions that were made, were they political? Where did they come from? Where does Maggie Thatcher and the Thatcherism fit in with all this?
Well, we've got proof. The Thatcher papers that have been released prove that she were micromanaging this. She scribbled in the margins of cabinet papers, actually working things out, like how many scab lorries it would take a day to keep a power station. It goes back to before the strike. Joe mentioned that they were determined to get revenge. We brought down a government in 1974. We brought down the Heath government, and they were determined it was never going to happen again. So they actually commissioned a report called the Ridley Report, it weren't a report, it was a blueprint about how to smash a strike. It talked about pick on a strong union. By that they meant the NUM. Set on all these lorry drivers to break the strike, institute a national police force, etc., etc. And that's what they did. And early in the strike, I mean, we were very successful in picketing every pit in the country out. We'd even got Nottinghamshire solid. And then Thatcher wrote pickets and to start and to the courts to start processing prosecutions faster. She was directly telling the police it's open season on picket, and that was about 4 weeks into the strike. I was actually one of the first people on the receiving end of that. I scratched my head, very Freudian. That I've got a scar there. April the 9th, 1984, Westwood Colliery, when a copper took a shine to the back of my head under Thatcher's orders and proceeded to smash it in with his truncheon. And that, as I say, they were told to do that. And I have to say, we can't let the police off this "we're only acting under orders" hook. They revelled in it. They loved it. They enjoyed it. They were waving their £10 notes, holding up signs saying Scargill pays for our mortgages, things like that. And it was orchestrated, as I say, Thatcher's hand from top to bottom on this. They were determined to break the NUM in order to send a lesson to the whole of the trade union movement that militancy can't win. And Ben and everybody who's listening, I am proud to say they might have defeated the strike, they haven't defeated the miners. You yourself, Ben, the Durham Miners Gala, 250,000 of us. Do we look like we're bloody defeated? We're still here, we're angry. I don't want justice alone. I want some bloody revenge for that copper that smashed my head in, for everybody that lost the jobs, for all those people that were injured. And our communities are wasted.
Oh, just lost John there for a second.
Thatcherism. Oh yeah, I lost myself. I'm getting carried away.
It's all right. I didn't want you to stop, and then you did.
Yeah. Well, it takes the hand of God to shut me up.
I mean, just talking about the police and the waving of the £20 notes or whatever they did. There was a lot of talk up here in the northeast and Easington and so on that they were most of them were kind of metropolitan police. Is that true? That, or were they coming from all over? But they weren't necessarily part of the the same area, were they?
No, they were. I mean, at Orgreave there was about 13 different police forces, which just adds even more to the fact. This was organised in advance. This was a time without mobile phones, internet. All the officers got briefed on their way over. There was a certain briefing that came out. It got mentioned in the film that the bodies, not heads. You were told to take your prisoner to a pre-organised place. When you'd arrested somebody, it didn't matter what you'd arrested them for, they'd fill that bit in later. But yeah, it wasn't just the Met Police. It was police from everywhere. I think here we do remember the presence of the Met Police because, it was clearly, a kind of felt like a north-south thing. But, I've heard horrendous stories of behaviour of the Met, but I don't want to give the Met the privilege of being the only police force that we are critical of. We're critical of a whole lot of police forces and how they behaved at Orgreave, and like you say, up in the northeast, and likewise down in the Kent mining communities, they had police from other forces dealing with them. This, the way this was organised. From start to finish of that strike, as Joe mentioned, and John has mentioned in the Ridley plan, all organised from start to finish.
Ben, if your listeners and viewers, so should I say, want to tune in, God, that showed my age then, didn't you, listeners? I was jealous earlier when you were talking to Sophie about not being born during the strike. I used to be known as the youngest Orgreave campaigner, Sophie. You've stolen that crown from me. But yeah, if your listeners and viewers, should I say, want to go to our website, OTJ, let me get it up, otjc.com. There's a diary on there by Bruce Wilson, and it's called Life on the Front Line, and it's every single day of his picketing throughout the year. And there's one brilliant chapter in his book where he rates the police of how violent they're going to be. So, like, by the end of the book, if you turn up and he knows it's the Met or it's Manchester Police, you can almost guess how the day is going to turn out. But really, for your viewers, really do go to the website, because it's got sort of 8-9 years worth of information on there now, and resources. And if people want to get more involved in campaign, then just click on that link and you can spend a good day wasting your time flicking through all our different tabs and what have you. It's a really good resource.
Well, yeah. Sophie, I just wanted to come back to you to talk about kind of what the effects are of Orgreave now, both in terms of the miners there around your kind of local areas, you said, but also like what it did to the communities. I mean, you obviously stood in an election just over a year ago, and you would have done an awful lot of door knocking and talking to people in the local community. Did Orgreave come up in the conversation, or the miners' strike come up, and how does it affect communities, after all this time?
Yeah, I mean, a weird way to describe it is kind of quietly massive. I think the effects of it are massive, but not always talked about as much as they should be, and not always traced back to not just Orgreave, but the whole of the miners' strike and what happened in that time period. But yeah, I think the effects are huge, and you can still see them if you really look for them. But in terms of does it come up in conversations, I'd say that massively depends on who you're speaking to. The effects of it certainly do, which I'll go on to in a minute. But yeah, absolutely. If you knock on the door of an ex-miner, or somebody who's got an ex-miner in their family, that's all you're going to be able to talk about, which is great. And some of the villages in the area I stood to represent, we're just finishing and still fundraising for memorials to miners, which is really good to see that they're keeping the history alive. So it's still a very a very strong part of local culture, and people haven't forgotten it, despite the election result. When we were analysing the results, at least in Rother Valley, the areas with the highest concentration of ex-miners still voted Labour by and large, but there's just a massive transient community around it, in terms of like new homes and bits and bobs popping up where there used to be fields and now quite expensive new builds. So the demographics of the area are changing quite a lot. So if you was to go to one of those new build estates, probably not. There's actually a really nice new build estate at the site of Orgreave, basically. And the local pub there has lots of pictures up. But if you mention it to the people there, they'd probably say, "Oh yeah, I've heard about it," but not much else. And we'd move on to other subjects like the NHS, schools. So a lot of those people living there were NHS workers, school teachers, etc. But yeah, I think the effects of it can still be seen almost everywhere you look. I mean, the effects of it in terms of like the political class and the socialist movements around it were massively demoralising, and you can see that today. So as Joe said earlier, when he said that, the quote from Arthur Scargill, that it would affect us all if the miners didn't win. I think that can be seen in terms of the lack of unionisation and what is often thought about unions. So people who really understand Orgreave as are fine, but I remember being younger and working in different pubs, bars, restaurants, whatever, and talk of a union was met with some hostility, even from young people generally not knowing what a union is, even if they weren't hostile, just thinking, what's that? Is that just something I pay my subs for? Is it a bit like insurance? I heard they do dental care or whatever, and that's generally the conversations you'd have with the kind of the young workforce. And this was a massive anti-union win. As John said, the unions aren't destroyed, the community isn't completely destroyed, and there's still a massive sense of solidarity around there. But it was a win for the anti-union campaigners, don't know what to call them, the establishment, and we can see that in the area. Some people have talked about blacklisting as well. I know people still living in the area who, you know, still suffering from blacklisting. That's another huge problem, and that, you know, there's campaigns that are associated with the Orgreave campaign are doing good work on that. But for me, kind of growing up nearby and working a lot in, you know, like I said, bars, restaurants, fast food, whatever, the biggest effect for me growing up is what I linked it to was all the 0 hours contracts and just the horrible conditions that we're under. It's not a sob story, but I mean, this probably happened to everyone my age, but I remember one New Year's Eve being asked to work a 24-hour shift. So do New Year's Eve, New Year's Day for £3.62 an hour. We already knew we weren't getting, you know, the set breaks that we're meant to have every 6 hours. There weren't even a break room. And kind of how we were trying to fight that was completely different to how that might have been fought 30, 40 years ago. And to be honest, I don't think that would ever have happened if unions were as strong as perhaps they once might have been, and as much as we'd want them to be. That absolutely would be out of the question, you know, and people are still suffering from that. I still can't get over it. 24 hours for £3.62 an hour. It's insane. Some of the conditions that are happening on the site, you know, where this happened, you know, what was once a really strong community, you know, where you could go into a job for life. I know that's not ideal and not what we'd always want, but, you know, at least people could take it for granted in some ways that they could get a job and that would, you know, pay for a home, a family, etc. Whereas now, what have we got? And this is, you know, the situation we're living in, and that is also massively demoralizing. Once we've got to the position which we're in now of having these 0 hours contracts and, you know, no industry at all apart from fast food, and that is what that industry seems to have been replaced in my area. You know, a lot of Starbucks, McDonald's popping up. Once we're into that position, how can we then build the unions back up? Because it's so hard when you're working all those hours, rushed off your feet, you know, completely understaffed, paid nothing. Remember, on a 0 hours contract, if you speak out, you could just be never offered another shift ever again, which is what people are, you know, scared shitless over. That's the main thing for people. If I unionize, if I speak out in any way and say, oh, I'm not sure, I'll just never be offered another shift again, and then I've got no money. You know, they don't even need a reason. It's just sacking you by default. So how can you actually unionise? In Sheffield, we've got Sheffield needs a pay rise. If any viewers don't know what that is, I probably haven't got time to go into it. Please Google them. Please look at the Facebook page, because they're doing great work at addressing those problems. But it's still undeniably really, really hard to win back those conditions and, you know, those rights that we fought for, the trade union movement fought for all those years ago. Over the last 100 years just seems to have been destroyed, not for everyone, but at least for people like me. It feels like we have no rights at work, you know, no security, nothing like that. So that's kind of the landscape of the community, and that's what we grow up to expect, I suppose. And then on top of that, you know, the demoralizing aspect of it, there's then the tactics of the police. And, you know, like I said, I always knew about that. Everybody in my area seemed to know about that, and that was taken for a given, not to trust the police, you know, not to trust the government, you know, which is a big threat to democracy. You know, not to trust these establishment figures, and I still don't. But that's really, really sad. And I think for a functioning, productive society that benefits all of us, we need that in place. So yeah, absolutely. I think the effects, they come up all the time, whether it's a minor or someone who doesn't even know that they're actually talking about the effects of that. But every single young person who said to me, oh, I don't really know how to explain it, I'm not massively into politics, it's all a bit shit, they're all the same, etc. That stems back to, in my area, Orgreave and the miners' strike, but then in the country at large, Thatcher's, you know, the whole of the policies. And you know, this was exactly what they wanted. They're in a good position right now, which is why I'm still in this campaign, you know, in the fight back, because we need to get out of this position. This can't be it forever. We need to progress.
Can I just mention one thing then about the effect on our communities, that every miner has 50% of his pension nicked. The government takes 50% of the profit of our miners' pension scheme, which is quite a profitable scheme because we tend to die a lot earlier than other folks. They take 50% of that into their coffers. They've stolen a total of £8 billion from miners. And when you drive around our towns and you see the boarded up shops and you see, you know, the despair and the desolation because people haven't got money, well, some of the money that they should have had to keep those shops alive went into the coffers of the government to literally throw at the bankers when they crashed the economy and things like this. And that's what I call class war reparations. That's our ongoing punishment for standing up to Thatcher and that government. And even today, if a miner suffering with lung disease dies, the doctor's liable to write on his death certificate COVID. So his dependents get nothing in terms of what they should receive in compensation. So we're still being robbed left, right, and centre. And it's just punishment for having the audacity to stand up.
I think it goes even further than that. I don't want to get all theoretical because I've only had 2 cans of Heineken. But the damage that it's done to the social fabric of our communities as well is tangible. Wherever there were a pit, there were a sports club. Wherever there were a pit, there were a working men's club. Wherever there were a pit, there were a band. All that's gone now, or there's just clinging on by its bare teeth. Where workers needed help with housing or social issues, or even sometimes into community politics, then the shop stewards of the National Union of Mine Workers would be looked to. So people would go and help them and get forms filled in, or they'd go and get help with getting access to housing, etc. So the whole Thatcher project of the 1980s about breaking the unions, I know we've all talked about this earlier. They had to defeat the National Union of Mine Workers because they were an obstacle that stood in their way. And because we lost the miners' strike, and let's be honest, because sometimes we wax lyrical, we lost. We have to take that on the chin. And what that's done is it's forced the union movement into retreat. So somehow in 1990s, we had this sort of trade union movement that, like Sophie touched on there. We're just trying to sell people cheap spectacles or like £5 off of towers or something, and we need to get away from that. We need to start building working class power back in the workplace. And it's not going to be easy, but it's something that we've all got to rise to. And I think what the work that Sophie's doing with the community union Acorn and the stuff that Sheffield needs a pay rise of doing as well. It's not in every city and town, but it certainly needs to be. So yeah, all power to you, Sophie.
Yeah. Can I just add about the kind of the solidarity actions that Joe were talking about? Often encompassed in a miners' welfare centre where you could go and get help for housing and lots of other social issues. Has it been replaced by charity? This solidarity is being replaced by charity, and that does have an effect on the community. For someone like me growing up under the New Labour charity, constantly being looked down on, which then also leads to they're just they're all poor people over there because they're scroungers, they're lazy, etc. Look at them, they've not got a job, despite there isn't any jobs. But this kind of attitude towards us. And the only places that we can go to get help is now charity, middle class run charity, with the big bosses at the top creaming off the top of it all. That does have a tangible effect on the consciousness of those communities. And it's a really horrible feeling to have that as the only, source of help that you can actually go to. I'm sure everybody much prefers other people like you helping them out and giving you advice and solidarity, not charity, every single time. But that's the situation that we're in now.
A couple of weeks ago, we were talking to Sarah Grant. I was talking to Sarah on this program. I think you know Sarah, don't you? Yeah. And we were talking about former miners voting Tory, and I think some of that is a much bigger issue, as you've described here. We obviously we can talk about Brexit and things like that, but it's really about that kind of, what the bigger thing here is about a lack of confidence and a lack of kind of, as you say, kind of consciousness in a way, which has been kind of ebbed away for a long time through defeats, isn't it? I mean, John,
Yeah.
do you want to just say something about that?
Well, it's a bit of an urban myth about a lot of miners voting Tory. If you look at the figures nationally, the Tory vote hardly shifted. What happened is the Labour vote collapsed, and
Yeah.
Sophie rightly points out that our communities now have been cannibalised by developers buying up cheap land and building houses for people who don't shop in community, who just live there because it's near somewhere else where they work. And also on top of that, we've been sold out by Labour governments for 50 years. Remember Harold Wilson's white hot heat of technologies? A lot of you aren't old enough to remember that. We've not even seen a spark of that. 300 pits closed under that Labour government. The new Labour government of Tory Blair, spit when you say that name, carried on robbing that pension scheme that I talked about, carried on letting the pits close. And all we got to New Labour in the main was imposed candidates because we were safe seats. We were treated like cannon fodder by people who didn't even want to know us, just wanted that creamed parliamentary salary because it was a safe Labour seat. So miners have not got a lot, to be honest, to thank Labour for historically. I mean, I've been a member for 49 years. I'm suspended now, the second time. I've been suspended in a few years. But, you know, if our party looked after our class in the same way that the Tories looked after their class, you wouldn't have lost all those red wall seats in the general election, and also you'd never have seen a Tory government again.
Yeah. I just wanted to come back to something that John also mentioned, Joe, that about the media during the strike. One of the things that is discussed in various kind of like articles about Orgreave was the reversal of the footage, the BBC reverse, and the kind of faux apology afterwards as well. How much does the media bear a responsibility, and how much of that kind of the view that was put out by the media, how much of that still holds?
I mean, the media plays its part in the miners' strike like it does in all working class injustices. You've only got to look at what happened at Hillsborough when they said that Liverpool fans were pickpocketing their dead fellow fans' pockets at Hillsborough. So it's and I've gone a bit deep on this today because I knew you were going to ask the question. So I was reading a bit of Gramsci earlier about cultural homogeny and all that sort of thing. And the media sets the narrative, doesn't it, for working class people, because that's the outlet that we rely upon to get our information. So I know Barnsley fans that up until not that long ago, a lot of them have changed the tune now because of the heroic work of the Hillsborough campaign, believed that Liverpool fans actually robbed the pockets of their fans. And these are football fans themselves from Barnsley who went through the miners' strike. So you can see how the state's narrative can get in people's heads, and it's a very powerful tool, and which is why I think we need more and more things like you've created tonight, Ben, to get our own message out there. I think that's really important. And I've written myself down a little quote, if you don't mind me reading it out, from one of my political heroes. It's Malcolm X, who talked about the media. And he said, the media is the most powerful entity on earth. They have the power to make the innocent guilty and to make the guilty innocent. And that's real power, because they control the minds of the masses. The press is so powerful in its image-making role, it can make a criminal look like he's the victim and make the victim look like he's the criminal. This is the press, an irresponsible press. It will make the criminal look like he's the victim and you're the criminal. Sorry, I've just repeated myself there. And if you aren't careful, the newspapers will have you hating the people who are being oppressed and loving the people who are doing the oppressing. And I thought, he nailed that, didn't he? Again, probably 30, 40 years ago. And that is what we see play out time and time again. Like Sophie were just saying, how they portray working class people about being scroungers because they can't find a job. Or now it's even worse than it. You've got a job, but it's not paying you enough, so we'll kick you off universal credit. You know what I mean? So it's always about dumbing down. And I think the media in the miners' strike played that so cleverly. Chris said right at the beginning of our discussion, every time one miner went back to work, it could be front page news. Look, these scabs, the worst scabs, these people are heroic. They're going back to work through these mass ranks of violent people. Not why are these miners out on strike in the first place? Does this pit need to close? What do we owe these people who have risked their lives building the country into what it is over the years? There's none of that narrative. So changing the narrative and having our own independent media is so important. And yeah, all power to you, Ben, for this show. I think we need to get more and more things out like that, and especially during lockdown, because I don't know, like everybody else, I'm sat at home raging at the TV on my own, and spending an evening talking politics and just having a chat with my comrades has made me feel a whole lot better, definitely.
That's great. That's really, really good to hear, Joe. And I think you're so right about the independent media. It's something that, I mean, during the Corbyn kind of period, the 4 or 5 years that we've had, I think in a way there's been so much firefighting that some of those things haven't happened, and I can understand why, because you know it's just intense, isn't it? And not an awful lot of thrown into Parliament and things. And when you have the chance to sit back, you start thinking about, you know, what you said there about Gramsci and narratives and how these things get into people's heads, like common sense, isn't it? You know, Chris, time's getting on, and we need to talk a little bit about the campaign and about, you know, where you're at with that. What's the sort of current legal situation? I know you're pushing for a full sort of independent inquiry into Orgreave. I just wondered where it stands at the moment, and also what sort of support you're getting from you know, Labour movement politicians and so on. I know that Jeremy Corbyn was, you know, immensely supportive and has been over a number of years. And the campaign, has that changed at all with the new leadership, and how's that all looking?
Yeah, well, I mean, first of all, I mean, the call for an inquiry into what happened at Orgreave didn't begin with us as a campaign. You know, we had proper socialist MPs in government, in Parliament at the time, who were shouting for it. People like Martin Flannery, who represented Hillsborough in Sheffield, people like Tony Benn, people like Dennis Skinner, and yes, Jeremy Corbyn. And if you have a look on our social media, there's a letter doing the rounds that Jeremy wrote to the NUM back in 1984. So the call for an inquiry isn't anything new. It just didn't get anywhere with that Thatcher government, inevitably. We stick with calling for an inquiry, but what we actually want is looking for our truth to be recognised as the truth. That is the key to it. And it's trying to find the vehicle to do that. There isn't one answer. Certainly, you know, we put together a legal submission, which we handed in to Theresa May when she was Home Secretary back in 2015. That eventually landed with Amber Rudd. And we did get our hopes up through what Amber Rudd did say in the meetings with us. And you may think you were naive to do that, but actually, if you Google Orgreave and the Times, 15th September 2016, there's actually an article with a headline saying Home Secretary to order inquiry into Orgreave. It was then quickly pounced upon the following day with a comment piece by Tebbit, basically, you know, bringing in the Tory old guard, dumbing that down. But a public inquiry, I think our comrades in Grenfell, you know, our comrades in the undercover police cop inquiry will tell you that public inquiries aren't necessarily the perfect answer. We are stuck with that, with the Inquiries Act. But actually, the Inquiries Act is quite limiting, because section, put my lawyer head on at the moment, but section 19 of the Inquiries Act puts the ordering of a public inquiry completely in the gift of the minister. It's completely in the gift at the moment of Priti Patel to order an inquiry. That ain't going to happen. There are other means. You know, Hillsborough came to a standstill and didn't seem to have anywhere to go when it had an independent panel that was set up. And we actually had somebody on our behalf, well, not on our behalf, but the Bishop of Sheffield, who actually came from Liverpool. He was whatever second in command a bishop is before you're a bishop. He was that role in Liverpool, and saw the hurt what Hillsborough was causing to the community and families there with the lack of accountability. He came to Sheffield in South Yorkshire and made a plea for a kind of independent panel. Even that was turned down. And that was actually supported, believe it or not, by the Chief Constable of South Yorkshire Police, who agreed with the bishop and said we'd be part of it. So you've got to look at other things. And I think, you know, at the moment, look north, because, you know, in Scotland, they've had an independent review of policing during the miners' strike. John Scott chaired an independent review, and they found that many of the convictions would never have been convicted in any other kind of political landscape. And there's moves there now to pass legislation to look at a collective pardon. You know, Scotland last week, the Scottish Parliament said we're not having the Chiz Bill. They voted it down. None of this abstaining on it. It was voted down. You know, so there are other means of getting justice, but the important thing is that you have accountability and the truth that comes from a credible tribunal panel, something that everybody has bought into and is willing to be bound by the results of it, and something that has got the power to call for papers to be released. There's an awful lot of information out there, but it's never actually all been put together and cross-referenced. So whilst we want a public inquiries aren't perfect. And just a little bit of a trailer, we are working with other sister campaigns, comrades at the Haldane Society of Socialist Lawyers, who are going to be looking into, you know, public inquiries and, you know, how to the system, because it's by no means perfect. Just on your point on the Labour Party, when we set up in 2012, we were having to persuade some Labour MPs to support us. With the campaigning that we did, and we were quite relentless on it, when we got a genuine socialist as our leader, we became Labour Party Manifesto. And if anybody had been to Labour Party conferences 2015, 16 onwards, you will remember when Diane Abbott mentioned that in the main conference room, the response that it got, a long, sustained standing ovation. The Labour Party did the miners no favour back in 1984, 85, I'm afraid. And actually some trade union leaders did the miners no favours in 1984, 1985 by not standing collectively with the NUM. However, the fact that that is Labour Party manifesto will stay there. We've had that assurance from the Shadow Home Secretary. He's made that assurance from the dispatch box in Parliament. I do personally struggle to see how that also sits with not voting down the Chiz Bill. I don't think those sit easily together at all, and I very much hope that Labour do change their position and we don't have another abstention on that bill. However, we have a Labour Party still committed to an inquiry into Orgreave, and why not? Because it is the right thing and the only thing to do. You know, that we've been assured will not be changing. And whenever the next general election is, it will be in the manifesto. That's what we've been told. And so, you know, we do need to see that happen. In the meantime, we keep pushing. There will be new correspondence with Priti Patel, if anybody's found out where she's been hiding after losing certain documents and what have you. But, you know, we continue. We never let it lie. We never give up. We take absolute inspiration from campaigns like Shrewsbury. Shrewsbury had got a legal avenue to go through because they still had not had a chance to have the convictions overturned in the Court of Appeal. That is going to be happening. That has been listed to happen this year. But not, I mean, they've been campaigning longer than we have, but we take inspiration from the work Shrewsbury 24 have done in getting their retrial, take inspiration from Scotland. We'd like a public inquiry, but one that gets to the truth, not something which is just, you know, trying to offer some sort of appeasement to make us go away. It's got to be thorough, it's got to be fully accountable, and it's got to have the power to make sure that the truth is what people really know, and that truth, that writing of our political and social history is what is put down.
And honestly, thanks so much for all the dedication and effort that you all put into this, because I do really think it's important, not just for the people that know about it and but know about Orgreave, but for the kind of, you know, education that it's giving the movement as we're, you know, as you're campaigning and as you're talking about it. And I know that there's a bit of a call out from your campaign that anybody that wants, you know, you to come along to their meeting, whether it's, you know, Labour Party, trade union, whatever, you know, you will provide speakers. And I think that's really important to spread the word. Just on that, and we're kind of like a bit over on this, but I think it's right that we're over. Just want to give you a chance to quickly sort of say, you know, where people can find out more about the campaign, what they can do to support it. You know, is there films and you know, material that they can access as well to educate themselves on Orgreave.
I don't mind saying a couple of words. The best source to go to is the blog. If you just put OTJC into Google, it'll come up. And on there, there's all the resources we've touched upon throughout this last hour or so. But importantly, there's things that you can buy, of course. We're just like every other campaign, we need money. So you can buy an Orgreave flag to take along to pickets or demonstrations. They've been really popular. We used to make our own and hand them out, but everyone used to nick them, so you have to buy them. The Trade Union Football and Alcohol Committee actually sell them for us, and if you don't know about them, check them out as well. We've got a DVD about miners' strike stories. That's not trade union leaders sat talking or anything. It's all the rank and file miners themselves and their families, and the Women Against Pit Closures telling the stories of the miners' strike. There's ways to get involved with freedom of information requests. There's letters you can send off. There's ways to invite us. So yeah, check out the blog OTJC, and that's where you'll find most of the stuff. But there's one thing I'd like to point out: the most comments I'm getting on social media is the fact that I'm drinking Heineken and not Guinness, or the fact that I bothered to read about Gramsci or get a quote from Malcolm X. Like, what the fuck?
That's good multitasking, that you're checking your social media at the same time. I don't know.
Unbelievable. That's the last time I put any preparation in.
Yeah, right. Well, I unless anybody else has got anything to add.
Can I just say one thing?
Absolutely, go.
And it's a slogan that we use, and to everybody who's tuning in, listening, we've now had 100,000 people of our class murdered by these Tories in this COVID cup. And all I can say is that won't last forever. And remember one of our slogans: never forgive and never forget.
And on that note, I think we'll wrap up. But thank you so much for coming on tonight. It's been, I knew it would be great, and it was. And thank you so much. And please, everybody, go out and support the Ugly Truth and Justice campaign. Do what you can to highlight it, tell people about it. And thank you so much for tonight, guys. Thank you. Cheers.
Cheers, everybody.
Bye.